Christopher George Latore Wallace was born on May 21, 1972, in Brooklyn, New York, a borough already known for producing legends, but also for burying dreams just as fast. He was raised in Bedford-Stuyvesant, a neighborhood shaped by poverty, crime, resilience, and survival. In the 1970s and 1980s, Bed-Stuy was not just a place, it was a pressure cooker. Drugs flooded the streets, violence was common, opportunities were rare, and every young boy growing up there learned early that the streets didn't forgive mistakes. Christopher was raised primarily by his mother, Voletta Wallace, a Jamaican immigrant who worked multiple jobs to keep her son out of trouble. She was strict, disciplined, and determined that her son would rise above the environment around him. She enrolled him in private school at a young age, believing education was his way out. But outside the classroom, Bedford-Stuy told a different story. The streets moved fast, money talked, and respect had to be earned. As Christopher grew older, the pull of the neighborhood became stronger. Despite being academically capable, even described by some teachers as intelligent and articulate, he began skipping school. The reality around him felt more immediate than textbooks. Survival mattered more than grades. By his teenage years, Christopher Wallace was already familiar with the underground economy. Hustling wasn't glamorized, it was normalized. He later admitted in interviews that he sold drugs during this period, not out of ambition but necessity. It was what he saw every day. It was how people survived. This dual life, a disciplined home and a chaotic street reality, created a contradiction that would later define his music. Because while Christopher was learning how to move in the streets, he was also learning how to observe them. He listened. He remembered faces. He remembered stories. And most importantly, he remembered how everything felt. From a young age, Christopher showed an unusual gift for words. He didn't just rhyme, he narrated. He could describe a room, a moment, a mistake with unsettling clarity. Friends noticed it early. Freestyle sessions weren't just entertainment, they were confessions. Bedford-Stuy became his classroom. Every corner had a story. Every hustle had consequences. Every decision carried weight. These experiences didn't just influence his future music, they wrote it. The themes that would later define the Notorious B.I.G., ambition, paranoia, guilt, hunger, loyalty, betrayal, all existed long before fame. They were born here in Brooklyn, in narrow hallways, crowded apartments, and streets where life could change in seconds. This wasn't a fairy tale beginning. This was the origin of a survival story. And what makes it haunting is this. By the time Christopher Wallace would later tell these stories to the world, many of the people he grew up with wouldn't be alive to hear them. This was the foundation. This was the environment that shaped his voice. This was the beginning of a story that would end far too soon. Before the fame. Before California. Before 1997. This was Christopher Wallace, long before the world knew the name the Notorious B.I.G. By the early 1990s, Christopher George Latore Wallace was no longer just observing the streets of Brooklyn. He was beginning to translate them into something dangerous, vivid, and impossible to ignore. At a time when hip-hop was evolving rapidly, voices were everywhere, but Christopher's voice was different, deep, heavy, unmistakable. When he spoke, it didn't sound like performance, it sounded like a confession. In Brooklyn, word travels fast. Freestyles spread through neighborhoods. Cassette tapes changed hands quietly. And before long, Christopher Wallace became known not just for rhyming, but for storytelling. His lyrics weren't exaggerated fantasies. They were reports from inside the environment people tried to escape. In 1992, a demo tape featuring Christopher reached Sean "Diddy" Combs, who at the time was working at Uptown Records. Sean Combs immediately noticed what others hadn't yet fully understood. This wasn't just another rapper. This was a narrator of street life with cinematic precision. Christopher Wallace was invited to record under the name Biggie Smalls, inspired by a childhood nickname. His first official appearance came on Mary J. Blige's song Real Love remix, followed by collaborations that quietly introduced his voice to the industry. But behind the scenes, instability was growing. When Sean Combs was fired from Uptown Records in 1993, many artists were left uncertain about their futures. Instead of retreating, Combs made a move that would change hip-hop history. He founded Bad Boy Entertainment, and one of the first artists he signed was Christopher Wallace. This was a turning point. Bad Boy Entertainment wasn't just a label, it was a vision. Sean Combs understood presentation, marketing, and timing. Christopher Wallace understood reality, pain, and consequence. Together, they created a formula that would redefine East Coast hip-hop. Under Bad Boy, Christopher Wallace adopted the name the Notorious B.I.G., a name that carried weight, threat, and identity. It wasn't just branding, it was a warning. Recording sessions began for what would become his debut album, Ready to Die. The title alone told a story. Unlike many albums at the time, Ready to Die was structured almost like a crime documentary. It wasn't a collection of singles, it was a narrative. Songs explored birth, temptation, crime, paranoia, regret, and death. Interludes simulated phone calls, arguments, and moments of reflection. The album was raw, unapologetic, and brutally honest. Released in September 1994, Ready to Die introduced the world to a version of New York that wasn't polished or romanticized. Tracks like Juicy told the story of survival and success, while songs like Gimme the Loot and Everyday Struggle exposed the mental toll of street life. Critics took notice, fans took notice, the industry couldn't ignore it. At a time when West Coast rap dominated mainstream attention, Ready to Die shifted the balance. The East Coast had found its voice again, and it belonged to the Notorious B.I.G. The album went multi-platinum, and Christopher Wallace became one of the most respected new artists in hip-hop almost overnight. His delivery was calm but threatening. His lyrics were poetic but terrifying. He made listeners feel like they were sitting beside him in a car, listening to plans unfold. But success came with consequences. Fame brought attention, attention brought pressure, and pressure brought enemies, some real, some imagined. As Ready to Die climbed charts and solidified the Notorious B.I.G. as a star, tensions within the hip-hop world began to surface. Alliances shifted, egos clashed, and behind the music, something darker was forming. What began as a rise fueled by talent and truth was slowly transforming into something dangerous. The streets Christopher Wallace once documented from the outside were now watching him closely. And the higher he rose, the more visible he became. This was no longer just a rap career. This was a trajectory, one that would eventually lead far from Brooklyn, all the way to California, and to 1997. The time Ready to Die reached the public, Christopher George Latore Wallace was no longer just a rapper from Brooklyn. He had become the Notorious B.I.G., a name that carried weight before the music even started. He was also still widely known as Biggie Smalls, a nickname that followed him from childhood into the industry. But no matter which name people used, the voice was unmistakable, deep, calm, measured. It didn't rush. It didn't panic. It sounded like someone who had already seen how stories ended. And that voice became the weapon. The first major breakthrough came with Juicy. Released as a single in 1994, the song wasn't just a hit, it was a confession. Instead of pretending success came easy, the Notorious B.I.G. detailed hunger, eviction notices, broken appliances, and doubt. He spoke openly about being poor, about dreaming of something bigger, about surviving long enough to see change. Listeners didn't just hear a song. They heard a life. Juicy became an anthem, not because it was flashy, but because it was honest. It connected the streets of Brooklyn to anyone who had ever felt overlooked. The song climbed charts, received heavy radio rotation, and solidified the Notorious B.I.G. as a voice of authenticity. But he didn't stay in one lane. Next came Big Papa, smooth, confident, controlled. The song showcased another side of the Notorious B.I.G., charisma, swagger, and dominance. Where Juicy showed survival, Big Papa showed arrival. It proved he could move effortlessly between vulnerability and power. This balance became his rememberable signature. Then there were tracks that cut deeper. Everyday struggle stripped away celebration entirely. Over a haunting beat, the Notorious B.I.G. described paranoia, stress, and the psychological weight of hustling. He didn't glorify the lifestyle, he dissected it. The song explored sleepless nights, fear of betrayal, and the constant pressure of staying alive. This wasn't entertainment. This was testimony. Warning pushed the storytelling even further. Structured like a phone call, the song played out a crime scenario with chilling realism. The listener wasn't just hearing about danger, they were inside it. The precision of his storytelling made every line feel immediate, like events unfolding in real time. What separated the Notorious B.I.G. from many of his peers was clarity. He didn't rely on speed or aggression. He relied on detail, facial expressions, street corners, conversations, consequences. His lyrics weren't exaggerated, they were observational. Many listeners believed they were hearing real moments replayed word for word. This was why his music felt dangerous. Because it sounded true. Critics praised his ability to merge commercial appeal with raw street narratives. Fans trusted him because he didn't sanitize his past or romanticize violence. He spoke about ambition, but also about regret, about success, but also about paranoia, about wealth, but also about guilt. By the mid-1990s, the Notorious B.I.G. wasn't just successful, he was influential. His style reshaped East Coast hip-hop. His flow became studied. His lyrics became quoted. His presence became dominant. But success didn't come without tension. The more visible he became, the more his words were analyzed. Lyrics were interpreted as messages. Songs were taken as threats. And in an era where hip-hop rivalries were already volatile, storytelling could be mistaken for provocation. The Notorious B.I.G. was now operating on a national stage. Brooklyn was watching. New York was watching. And soon, California would be watching too. The music that brought him power would also bring him scrutiny. The stories that made him famous would later be dissected line by line. And as his influence grew, so did the danger surrounding him. This was the height of his artistry. This was the moment his voice carried the most weight. And it was only the beginning of what would become one of the most closely examined stories in hip-hop history. By the mid-1990s, Christopher George Latore Wallace had become one of the most recognizable figures in hip-hop. To the public, he was the Notorious B.I.G., confident, dominant, untouchable. But away from microphones and cameras, his life was far more complicated. Fame did not simplify his world. It multiplied it. Behind the success, Christopher Wallace was navigating relationships, fatherhood, pressure, and fear, all while carrying the weight of a past that never fully let go. In 1994, while recording at Bad Boy Entertainment, Christopher met Faith Evans, a rising R&B singer also signed to the label. Their connection was immediate and intense. According to public interviews from both parties, they married just 9 days after meeting. The speed of the marriage shocked the industry. To outsiders, it looked reckless. To those close to them, it felt impulsive, emotional, and rooted in a need for stability during chaos. Fame had arrived fast. Expectations were heavy, and Christopher Wallace was living in a world where trust felt rare. The marriage between the Notorious B.I.G. and Faith Evans quickly became public, scrutinized, and controversial. Their relationship existed under constant pressure, from media attention, professional demands, and the growing tensions within the hip-hop world. But while headlines focused on celebrity, Christopher Wallace was also a father. Before his marriage to Faith Evans, he had already welcomed a daughter, Tiana Wallace, born in 1993. Those close to him have publicly stated that he took pride in fatherhood, even while struggling to balance responsibility with a lifestyle built on movement and unpredictability. Later in 1996, his son Christopher C.J. Wallace Jr. was born just months before Christopher Wallace's death. 2 children, 2 legacies, and a man trying to reconcile who he was with who he needed to become. Despite the wealth, success, and recognition, Christopher Wallace often spoke, both directly and indirectly, about stress, paranoia, and exhaustion. His lyrics reflected this tension. Songs referenced fear of betrayal, surveillance, and the feeling that danger was never far away. These weren't metaphors. As his fame grew, so did the number of people around him: managers, label executives, security associates. But more people didn't mean more safety. It meant more variables, more risk, more eyes watching. Marriage did not shield him from that reality. Faith Evans later spoke publicly about the strain fame placed on their relationship, long absences, constant rumors, and the emotional toll of being married to someone living under threat. The union was passionate, but unstable, existing in a world where peace was hard to maintain. Christopher Wallace was still connected to Brooklyn, still tied to people from his past, still navigating loyalty, a theme that followed him throughout his life and music. And that dual existence, superstar and street survivor, created constant tension. At home, he was a father. In public, he was a symbol. In the industry, he was a target. This complexity is often overlooked when discussing the Notorious B.I.G., but it is essential to understanding what came next, because the man behind the lyrics was not immune to fear, doubt, or vulnerability. He was building a future for his children, trying to protect his family, trying to maintain control in a world that thrived on chaos. And as pressures mounted from fame, rivalries, and unresolved conflicts, the personal and professional began to collide. The life beyond the lyrics was not glamorous. It was unstable, and it was becoming increasingly dangerous. What followed would push these tensions to their breaking point and pull Christopher Wallace into a conflict far larger than himself. By the mid-1990s, hip-hop was no longer just music. It had become identity, territory, and power. And at the center of it stood Christopher George Latore Wallace, known to the world as the Notorious B.I.G. What many later called the East Coast versus West Coast feud did not begin as a war. It began as relationships, friendships, alliances, misunderstandings, slowly poisoned by ego, paranoia, and public pressure. Before the rivalry, there was respect. The Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur were not enemies at first. In the early 1990s, they knew each other personally. Tupac Shakur was already an established artist, politically outspoken and nationally recognized. Christopher Wallace was still rising, absorbing everything around him. Tupac Shakur openly supported Christopher Wallace early in his career. He invited him to shows, gave advice, and spoke positively about his talent. At one point, Tupac Shakur even referred to the Notorious B.I.G. as his little brother. But the industry they operated in thrived on tension. As the Notorious B.I.G.'s fame exploded through Bad Boy Entertainment, the dynamics shifted. Money entered the picture. Labels gained influence. Media outlets began framing narratives, often exaggerating conflict for attention. In November 1994, everything changed. Tupac Shakur was shot multiple times in the lobby of Quad recording studios in Manhattan. He survived, but the psychological damage was immediate. Tupac Shakur publicly stated, "Remember that the Notorious B.I.G. and Sean Diddy Combs were aware of the situation beforehand," a claim both men consistently denied. No evidence ever confirmed their involvement. But suspicion doesn't need proof to grow. From that moment on, trust collapsed. While Tupac Shakur was incarcerated on unrelated charges shortly afterward, tensions hardened. The media amplified every comment, every lyric, every appearance. East Coast and West Coast labels became symbols of loyalty rather than business. Bad Boy Entertainment represented New York. Death Row Records, led by Suge Knight, represented Lowe's Angels. And the artists became representatives, whether they wanted to or not. Lyrics were now decoded like threats. Songs were treated like public statements. Silence was interpreted as guilt. When the Notorious B.I.G. released music during this period, some interpreted his lyrics as subliminal attacks. When Tupac Shakur released Hit 'Em Up in 1996, the feud reached a level of hostility that could no longer be ignored. The song openly targeted the Notorious B.I.G., Bad Boy Entertainment, and their associates. It was raw, direct, and deeply personal. Any remaining possibility of reconciliation vanished. Hip-hop fans took sides. Radio stations fueled division. Magazines printed headlines framing the feud as a cultural war. And the consequences moved beyond music. Artists began traveling with increased security. Shows became volatile. Public appearances felt unpredictable. For Christopher Wallace, this was unfamiliar territory. His music had always been rooted in storytelling, not political statements or public beefs. Yet he was now positioned as the face of East Coast dominance. Meanwhile, Tupac Shakur became the voice of West Coast retaliation. The feud was no longer personal. It was symbolic. In September 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas, Nevada, and died days later. His murder sent shockwaves through the industry. Fear replaced rivalry. The stakes became horrifyingly clear. For the Notorious B.I.G., everything changed overnight. The atmosphere shifted from competition to survival. Publicly, Christopher Wallace expressed sadness and denied involvement in Tupac Shakur's death. Privately, those close to him reported growing concern for his safety. The idea that music could lead to real violence was no longer theoretical. It had happened. Despite calls for peace, the damage was already done. The feud had created an environment where perception outweighed truth, and association alone could be dangerous. Christopher Wallace was now viewed differently on the West Coast, not as an artist but as a symbol. And symbols are often targeted. This feud didn't just divide hip-hop. It destabilized it. And as the Notorious B.I.G. prepared to travel to California in early 1997, the unresolved tensions from this conflict followed him, silently, heavily, and dangerously. What began as a friendship had dissolved into mistrust. What began as competition had escalated into tragedy. And the consequences were not finished yet. By early 1997, Christopher George Latore Wallace was standing at a crossroads few artists ever reach. He had survived the streets of Brooklyn. He had dominated the charts. He had endured public feuds, private losses, and constant pressure. And now, he was preparing to release what many would later call his defining work. The album was titled Life After Death. The name alone felt unsettling, almost prophetic. Recorded primarily in 1996, Life After Death was ambitious in scale and tone. Unlike Ready to Die, which focused heavily on survival and struggle, this album expanded outward. It explored wealth, power, betrayal, mortality, and legacy. Christopher Wallace was no longer just documenting where he came from, he was questioning where all of it led. By early March 1997, the album was complete. Life After Death was scheduled for release on March 25, 1997, under Bad Boy Entertainment and Arista Records. Promotional plans were already in motion. As part of that rollout, the Notorious B.I.G. traveled to Los Angeles, California. This decision mattered. California was not neutral ground. Less than 6 months earlier, Tupac Shakur had been killed in Las Vegas. The East Coast versus West Coast feud was still raw. Tensions hadn't cooled, they had hardened. Many in Christopher Wallace's circle were uneasy about the trip, but professionally, the promotion was unavoidable. In Los Angeles, the Notorious B.I.G. began a packed schedule. He recorded the music video for Hypnotize, one of the album's lead singles. The video portrayed luxury, success, and confidence, a stark contrast to the anxiety surrounding his presence on the West Coast. To the public, he looked relaxed. In reality, security was tight. He also conducted radio interviews, promotional appearances, and press engagements. On air, he projected calm. He dismissed rumors. He emphasized unity. But behind the scenes, concerns remained. Those close to him later described a mix of focus and fatigue. Christopher Wallace was working constantly, promoting an album, representing a label, protecting his image, protecting his family, and navigating an environment shaped by unresolved violence. Despite the tension, Life After Death was shaping up to be a landmark project. The album featured multiple styles, introspective tracks, street narratives, radio-ready singles, and darker reflections. It showcased his growth as an artist and his ability to adapt without losing authenticity. Collaborations expanded his reach. Production was polished but still rooted in grit. Unknowingly, Christopher Wallace was recording his final statements, his final reflections, his final version of himself. In interviews during this period, he spoke about the future, about business, about longevity, about wanting to transition into executive roles and focus on his children. There was no indication that he believed his life was about to end. But history has a lead-up. And this was it. The days leading up to March 9, 1997 were filled with movement. Studio sessions, events, meetings, late nights. The promotional push brought him into spaces filled with industry figures, celebrities, and media, all while Los Angeles watched closely. Life After Death would eventually be released 16 days after his death. It would debut at number 1. It would sell millions. It would be praised as a masterpiece. But Christopher Wallace would never see it. As he moved through Los Angeles during those final days, few could have imagined how quickly everything would change. The city that hosted his promotion would soon become the setting of one of hip-hop's most enduring mysteries. He had survived Brooklyn. He had survived fame. He had survived rivalry. But the final chapter was already approaching. And it would begin on a single night, after a party, after a celebration, after the cameras stopped rolling. By March 7, 1997, Christopher George Latore Wallace had already been in Los Angeles, California for several days. Officially, the purpose of the trip was promotion. Unofficially, the tension surrounding his presence on the West Coast was impossible to ignore. That night, the Notorious B.I.G. attended the Soul Train Music Awards, held at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. The event was one of the most visible celebrations of black music and culture, televised, crowded, and filled with industry power players. When Christopher Wallace took the stage to present an award, the reaction was mixed. Applause was there, but so were boos. The response was brief but unmistakable. For many observers, it reflected lingering resentment tied to the East Coast versus West Coast feud, still raw months after the death of Tupac Shakur. Even in a room meant for celebration, the division followed him. Christopher Wallace did not respond publicly. He did not address the crowd. He finished his role and exited. But moments like this mattered. They confirmed what many already felt, that Los Angeles was not neutral territory. The tension wasn't imaginary. It was present, audible, and public. Despite that, the weekend continued. On March 8, 1997, Los Angeles prepared for one of the most talked-about industry events of the year. Vibe magazine, in partnership with Q West Records, hosted a high-profile after-party at the Petersen Automotive Museum, located on Wilshire Boulevard. The party was meant to celebrate the success of the Soul Train weekend, a gathering of artists, executives, celebrities, and media figures. Invitations were limited. Security was present. The location itself symbolized luxury and exclusivity. The Notorious B.I.G. attended. He arrived surrounded by associates, including members of Bad Boy Entertainment. Among them was Sean "Diddy" Combs, whose presence drew attention throughout the night. The atmosphere inside the museum was crowded, loud, and energetic. Witnesses later described the party as tense beneath the surface. Christopher Wallace was seen socializing, taking photos, and moving through the event. He did not appear visibly distressed, but those close to him have since said security concerns were constant. The West Coast still felt unpredictable. At some point during the evening, the Los Angeles Fire Department shut down the party due to overcrowding. Guests were asked to leave. What was meant to be a controlled celebration quickly spilled onto the street. Cars lined Wilshire Boulevard. Crowds gathered outside. Security struggled to manage the exit. Christopher Wallace left the Petersen Automotive Museum shortly after midnight in a GMC Suburban. He was seated in the front passenger seat. Sean "Diddy" Combs traveled in a separate vehicle ahead. The night felt ordinary to many in attendance. But in retrospect, every moment would be analyzed. The Soul Train booze. The crowded party. The location. The timing. This was not just another celebrity appearance. It was the final public outing of Christopher George Latore Wallace. Within minutes of leaving the museum, the environment changed. Traffic slowed. Vehicles separated. The streets of Los Angeles became quiet. What happened next would become one of the most scrutinized sequences in hip-hop history. A moment replayed through witness statements, police reports, and speculation for decades. The celebration was over, and the final chapter was about to begin. Just after 12:30 a.m. on March 9, 1997, Christopher George Latore Wallace left the Petersen Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, California, following the Vibe and Q West Records party. The night air was calm, traffic was light, and the celebration had ended without incident, at least on the surface. Christopher Wallace was riding in a GMC Suburban, seated in the front passenger seat. The vehicle moved westbound on Wilshire Boulevard, surrounded by other cars leaving the event. Sean "Diddy" Combs was traveling separately in a lead vehicle, accompanied by security. As the convoy approached the intersection of Wilshire Boulevard and South Fairfax Avenue, traffic slowed. The Suburban came to a stop at a red light. That pause mattered. According to police reports and eyewitness accounts, a black Chevrolet Impala pulled up alongside the passenger side of Christopher Wallace's vehicle. The car stopped close enough that the driver's window aligned with where Christopher Wallace was seated. There was no warning, no argument, no exchange, no time to react. The driver of the black Chevrolet Impala rolled down the window and fired multiple shots into the Suburban at close range. Witnesses later reported hearing at least 4 gunshots. Christopher Wallace was struck 4 times. One bullet hit his torso, another struck his arm, another entered his back. One caused catastrophic internal damage. Glass shattered. Screams followed. The Impala immediately sped away from the scene, disappearing into the streets of Los Angeles. Chaos erupted at the intersection. The driver of the Suburban accelerated, racing towards Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, just minutes away. Inside the vehicle, Christopher Wallace was unresponsive. Those with him attempted to keep him conscious, but his injuries were severe. Emergency personnel were alerted as the vehicle arrived. Doctors rushed Christopher Wallace into surgery. Multiple teams worked to stop internal bleeding. Despite their efforts, the damage was extensive. One of the bullets had penetrated vital organs, causing massive blood loss. At 1:15 a.m., Christopher George Latore Wallace was pronounced dead. He was 24 years old. The news spread rapidly. Within hours, radio stations interrupted programming. Television networks broke the story. Fans gathered outside hospitals and studios. The shock was immediate and global. Less than 6 months after the death of Tupac Shakur, hip-hop had lost another defining figure, under eerily similar circumstances. Police secured the scene at Wilshire and Fairfax. Shell casings were collected. Witnesses were interviewed. Descriptions of the shooter were vague. The black Chevrolet Impala became the primary lead. But there were no arrests that night. No weapon recovered. No suspect detained. In the days that followed, questions multiplied. Why was the vehicle able to approach so closely? Who knew Christopher Wallace's exact location? Was this random or planned? The answers did not come quickly. And decades later, many of them still haven't come at all. At 1:15 a.m. on March 9, 1997, Christopher George Latore Wallace was pronounced dead at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, California. He was 24 years old. The announcement came less than an hour after the shooting at Wilshire Boulevard and South Fairfax Avenue. Despite emergency surgery and the efforts of multiple trauma specialists, the injuries were too severe. According to the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, Christopher Wallace was struck by 4 gunshot wounds. Autopsy findings later confirmed that one of the bullets traveled through his torso, damaging vital organs and causing massive internal bleeding. That injury was determined to be fatal. The cause of death was ruled homicide. By sunrise, the reality had settled in. Christopher Wallace, the Notorious B.I.G, Biggie Smalls, was gone. Outside Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, fans gathered in shock. Some cried. Some stood in silence. Others refused to believe the reports at all. Less than 2 weeks earlier, he had been recording music videos, doing interviews, and promoting life after death. Now the album's title felt chillingly literal. The Los Angeles Police Department immediately launched a homicide investigation. The crime scene at Wilshire and Fairfax was processed. Shell casings were recovered. Witnesses were interviewed. Descriptions of the suspect vehicle, a black Chevrolet Impala, were circulated internally. But there were problems from the start. Witness accounts varied. Some described the shooter as a lone gunman. Others couldn't provide clear details at all. The area was crowded, dark, and chaotic. The shooter fled within seconds, leaving little physical evidence behind. No weapon was recovered. No clear suspect was identified. Within days, the investigation expanded beyond Los Angeles. Federal authorities monitored developments. Media outlets dissected every detail. The public demanded answers. None came. As weeks turned into months, speculation began to grow. Some theories focused on the unresolved East Coast versus West Coast feud. Others examined industry rivalries, personal conflicts, or organized retaliation. Investigative journalists later questioned the handling of the case, suggesting missteps, misleads, and possible corruption. but officially, the facts remained unchanged. No arrests were made. No charges were filed. No one was ever convicted. The murder of Christopher George Latore Wallace remains unsolved. In the absence of answers, controversy filled the void. Books were written, documentaries were produced, lawsuits were filed, allegations surfaced and were denied. Over the years, retired detectives, journalists, and former insiders offered conflicting accounts. None resulted in a resolution. What is known is this: Christopher Wallace was unarmed. He was seated in a vehicle stopped at a red light. He was shot at close range. And he died minutes later. His death came just 6 months after the killing of Tupac Shakur, further deepening the sense that hip-hop had entered a deadly chapter, one where music, identity, and violence had become dangerously intertwined. For his family, there was no closure. For his children, there was no goodbye. For the culture, there was an absence that could never be filled. And for investigators, there was a case that refused to close. The loss of the Notorious B.I.G. was not just the loss of an artist, it was the silencing of a voice that documented an era with brutal honesty, a voice that survived Brooklyn, fame, and rivalry, but not that final night in Los Angeles. The mystery remains, and the final question still hangs in the air. Who killed Christopher Wallace? Even in death, Christopher George Latore Wallace, the Notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls, continued to shape the world around him. Just 16 days after his murder on March 25, 1997, his second album, Life After Death, was released posthumously. The title felt eerily prophetic, yet despite the tragedy that preceded its release, the album soared to the top of the charts. Fans and critics alike recognized it as a defining work, not just of East Coast hip-hop, but of the genre as a whole. Life After Death was monumental in scope. It was a double album over 2 hours of music, carefully structured to explore both celebration and consequence. Tracks like Hypnotize projected charisma, dominance, and style, while songs like 10 Crack Commandments and Sky, The Limit, offered hard-hitting lessons from the streets, mixing practicality, philosophy, and personal reflection. The album proved that Christopher Wallace was more than a rapper. He was a chronicler of his environment, a storyteller with unmatched precision, and a voice that bridged the streets and the mainstream. His lyrics were deeply personal, yet universally relatable, tackling ambition, loss, temptation, and survival. Critics lauded his artistry. Rolling Stone called Life After Death a masterpiece that solidified the Notorious B.I.G. as one of the greatest lyricists of his generation. Sales reflected the acclaim. The album went multi-platinum within weeks, cementing Christopher Wallace's commercial and artistic dominance, even after death. His influence didn't stop there. Artists across the globe cite the Notorious B.I.G. as a primary inspiration. From the cadence of modern hip-hop flows to the structure of narrative rap, his fingerprints are everywhere. Musicians study his timing, his voice, his storytelling, and his ability to turn personal experience into art. Beyond music, his cultural impact is undeniable. Biggie Smalls became a symbol of East Coast pride, resilience, and authenticity. His life story, from the streets of Brooklyn to superstardom, continues to resonate, illustrating the complex realities behind fame, creativity, and survival. His struggles and triumphs are documented not only in music, but in books, films, and countless retrospectives examining the evolution of hip-hop in the 1990s. Decades later, formal recognition caught up with his legacy. In 2020, Christopher George Latore Wallace was posthumously inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, alongside other music legends. This honor cemented his status as not just a hip-hop icon, but a figure of global cultural influence, one whose artistry transcended genre, geography, and time. His children, Tiana Wallace and Christopher C.J. Wallace Jr., continue to carry his legacy forward. The music, the memory, and the story of the Notorious B.I.G. remain alive, influencing new generations of artists, fans, and listeners worldwide. His story serves as a reminder that greatness can emerge from adversity, but it also serves as a warning. Fame and talent do not make one invincible. The life of Christopher Wallace was brilliant, fast, and tragic, and the echoes of his voice continue to reverberate through music, culture, and history. Even now, decades later, one question lingers for the world. What might he have accomplished if he had survived? The impact of the Notorious B.I.G. endures. His lyrics are studied, sampled, and celebrated. His life is analyzed, memorialized, and honored. And for fans and historians alike, his story is more than music. It is a chronicle of ambition, struggle, and the human cost of fame. Christopher George Latore Wallace will always remain one of hip-hop's greatest voices. A storyteller who transformed pain, ambition, and reality into art that will resonate for generations.